Hi, Pippa.
Hello, Patrick.
This is Pippa Malmgren. I'm Patrick Walker, and this is The Collective. Hi, Collective people.
Hello.
How you guys doing today?
Very good.
So we're here in near Le Mans, where we are at the Le Mans Classic and enjoying the beauty of the French countryside as well as the power and beauty of these amazing classic cars. But today we're taking a moment to talk with Pippa a little bit about geopolitics, what's happening in the world today, what we can sort of look forward to or not look forward to in the coming months ahead. So just wanted to see, you've just come in from which country? Because you travel a lot.
I can't even remember where the heck I've come from. I've been in so many places, and certainly since COVID, I've pretty much been living on the road, trying to get a grip on how people are thinking about not just geopolitics, but the world economy and who's trying to build it where. And so I come away actually optimistic, but we have a very complex environment that we have to navigate.
You wrote a book called Signals about things that you notice on your travels. And it was like a few years ago, right? You wrote this book. And some interesting insights that actually many of them proven to be true in terms of the inflation and so forth. So what are the signals you're seeing out there today?
So just to be clear, signals was a concept. I'm an economist. I grew up in the world of politics and economics, and so mainly we wait for governments to tell us what the data says. But the thing is, by the time you get that data, it's too late to do anything about it. So instead of waiting to be shown we have inflation, for example, could you see it earlier? And my argument was you can. And the way you do it is you stop relying on numbers and you start relying on your eyes.
Right.
And common sense.
Right, that packet of crisps that used to be full and now it's the same price, but it's
But they're like three potato chips in it.
Three chips.
Exactly.
No, we all noticed this, right?
And everybody, when I was tweeting about this a few years back, saying inflation is building in the system, and you can see it every time you go to the checkout counter because all the chocolate bars keep getting smaller.
Yeah.
And everyone on Twitter was like, yes, this is terrible. They were very emotional about it. But it's a sign there's margin pressure. And my argument was that as inflation starts to bubble back, it will bring geopolitics with it.
Yep.
Because countries like China, for example, can't feed themselves. And when they get inflation, their history tells them they always get political instability with inflation. So they'll start reaching for the resources they need more aggressively. South China Sea, what's there? Fish, like literally fish. And if you have a protein issue, you've got to feed your population. That's very valuable.
Right.
Suddenly, South China Sea becomes a hot geopolitical argument.
Yep.
And so that was the concept behind, there are signals that you can see that are hints about the future that are not yet in the data.
Right, and the big signals now that you're picking up at this post-COVID period?
Well, where to begin? There's so many. The areas I've been most interested in is the developments in space, because not only is that an entirely new economy that potentially solves many of our earthbound problems, the real potential for cheap and green energy from space, and for raw materials, refined raw materials from space. So we don't have to rip Earth up anymore or use hydrocarbons.
Yep.
And that's one reason the Saudis are backing space-based solar power with the British to try this new project over the North Sea. But the thing is, we already know it works. So that's coming. So that's a game changer. And so a signal I see is very interesting. When I talk to people who are involved in space, they are deeply knowledgeable about where we've already basically built the interplanetary internet. It pretty much exists. It's being finished right now. But when I talk to everybody who isn't involved with it, including chief executives of major tech companies, they're like, what? They literally have not clocked what is happening. And I think that's very interesting. It's a symptom of a world where there's too much information to process. So everybody's busy doing their thing, and then major events can occur that they miss.
Right.
So that itself is a kind of signal about the state of the world. I'm very focused on geopolitics, and I've been arguing for quite a long time that we've had so many signals that this conflict between the superpowers was unfolding. But the media like simple stories, overarching narratives, good guys, bad guys.
Yeah.
And so Ukraine is always what's talked about. But there's an invisible war that's much bigger than that. And it starts with conflict in space, which we've had for, in my opinion, 5 or 6 years. But there are no journalists in space. And literally, there are no journalists there. And it's all classified. So only the people in the inner circle really know what that warfare looks like and why it matters for Earth. And when I talk to general audiences and I say, basically the superpowers are blowing up their own satellites to create debris fields to basically deny the other access to certain orbits.
Really?
Yeah, so it's a denial of use strategy, but in a whole different way.
Just by creating space junk to block the path.
Yeah, they call it the Kessler effect, which is described as razor blades in a washing machine.
Oh.
And this is one of the things that forced the International Space Station to nearly have to evacuate, was because Russia destroyed one of their own really big satellites. I think it was nearly 4,000-pound satellite, very old one. And the thing is, you can't really do anything about them destroying their own satellite. But the debris field it's created has had massive impact on the development of space at a time when we're putting more and more satellites out there. So most people, when I explain this, they're like, well, this has nothing to do with me. And I go, well, basically your missile guidance systems don't work if they're all smashed up by this stuff. And if there's real warfare between satellites. But also, no more Uber Eats, right? People don't get that GPS is a space phenomena, right? So you take out GPS and we've got real problems on how we manage things here on Earth. So that's one area that's really important. But it's not only there, it's also the Arctic, and there's a big fight between the superpowers over the Arctic, the high
Arctic?
north.
What's happening there? Is it a resource question?
Well, it's a number of things. So I'll give you a specific incident that I think was really important that kicked this whole thing off visibly, which was 50 days before the Russian tanks rolled into Ukraine. Somebody cut the fastest internet cable in the world, which is in Svalbard in Norway, inside the Arctic Circle. And you're like, why is the fastest internet connection in the world in this incredibly remote place? And the answer is because pretty much every high altitude satellite connects to Earth at Svalbard. That is the cable where everything from space connects to Earth. And so when someone took away, I think it was 6.5 kilometers of it, so it's not like it hit it's not like it hit a rock. Yeah. They clipped it and then took the middle bit away. But luckily there was a lot of redundancy built in. But at the time, I remember the newly appointed British chief of the Defense Forces, Sir Tony Ratigan, came out and said, this would normally be considered an act of war. And then that stopped. It literally immediately went away because everybody realized if that was an act of war, then we are at war with Russia. And we don't want to be in a superpower conflict because that will immediately go nuclear, because that's the way the Russians always go.
Was that an American funded or backed or European funded or backed internet cable that was coming from the space station?
That's a good question. What's the financing of the cable system? Which I'm not an expert enough to tell you that. But I can tell you that since that event, we've had nearly continuous attacks on subsea internet cables all over the world. The Marseille cable, they call it, which connects the US, Europe, and Asia, that was hit several times, big chunks of it taken out. Most recently, we had a cable cut between the Shetland Islands and the Faroe Islands. And everybody's like, so who cares? Like, it's a bunch of sheep, right, on islands. But no, this cable is particularly important in a world where Russia's threatening to use nuclear weapons.
But these were underwater cables?
They're the underwater deep sea cables. And that one matters because that's where we track Russian submarines, and particularly to see if they're loaded with nuclear weapons as they come through what they call the GUK gap, the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. And everybody's on high alert because the Russians have not only been threatening it, but Norwegian intelligence, who are normally totally invisible. Like, there's just nothing if you Google them. All of a sudden, the head of Norwegian intelligence and their head of their military came out a couple months ago and said, this is a problem. We're going to see the Russians actually deploying these things we're not talking about Ukraine anymore.
Yeah.
We're talking about other locations. And so
Right.
we're on much higher alert than we have been.
Okay.
So I think a lot of the civilian population doesn't really get the level of alertness that everybody is on with the nuclear threat.
Right.
And so those are some of the things that I'm looking at in geopolitics. But again, it's even bigger than that.
Yeah.
It goes into Africa.
Yeah.
So I've described it as we're in a hot war in cold places, meaning space, the Arctic,
That's a good phrase.
and the high north. And by the way, the Arctic's also important because it has hydrocarbons, raw materials, and a ton of protein. And China can now go across, because they have the fastest icebreakers in the world, from Dalian to Rotterdam, which is their Belt and Road route through the Arctic, now in 28 days. And partly because the Arctic is easier to get through as it's melting. And what are they doing? They're scoping out all of these things they can harvest. And are there rules about this? Yes, but who's there to enforce it? I mean, it's like the Chinese have the fastest icebreakers in the world. Russia has a lot of them. Guess how many the U.S. has in the Arctic?
2.
1.
Okay, that's close.
We have 1. So the Arctic
Wait, and
is
this
like in
is
play.
this international, considered international frozen water, or is it actually
Well, some of it,
contested in terms of?
it's been contested mainly between China and Russia.
Huh.
But Russia, basically, it's like all of Eastern Russia, all the way up to the Arctic.
Yeah.
The Russians are like, this is ours.
Of course.
And there are like 3 people there. And the Chinese have 1 million that can move
Yeah.
in. It's a numbers game.
So they're doing the same game they've done in the South China Sea, like attaching new naval bases to undersea coral reefs
Yes.
and calling it theirs.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the hot war for a second.
Yeah.
So Ukraine, based on what you're saying, it shouldn't have been a surprise to
Yeah,
a lot of people.
I
It's more of a
think
symptom of a much greater ongoing conflict, and it's now a volcano that's erupted along a belt that's actually quite hot in many different places, just not yet visible. And it's particularly of interest now because of internal Russian politics, supposed attempted coup, and also now with the elections coming up, new politicians and old politicians, Trump, but also RFK Jr. coming out and saying, if it were them in office, they would end the war in a day. So how are you seeing the state of the Ukraine war, and particularly what might happen within Russia? And we'll get to the U.S. politics.
Okay, so it's a small question.
Yeah, small.
So I think what's happening is everybody understands, and our American military leaders have been persistently saying this, that Ukraine is outgunned and outmanned, and eventually they will not be winning. Politically incorrect as that may be, that's the assessment of the military.
Our military.
Our
The U.S.
military.
military is saying.
The U.S.
yeah.
General Milley
Okay,
has
yeah.
said it, and a number of our senior military leaders,
Yep.
basically like, they can't really keep this up forever. And so then what do you do? The superpowers don't want to get directly in because, again, it'll go straight to a nuclear threat.
Yep.
So the kind of hope was exactly what's happened, that Russia would have an internal implosion and their political leadership would change from the inside. Because as they weren't winning, I mean, they are winning it just very slowly
Yeah.
and with a lot of loss along the way. And so when some events happened on the Russian side that kind of changed the picture. And one little detail that I think is interesting that's been kind of missed is one of President Putin's personal security staff, the equivalent of, a presidential bodyguard, defected to Kazakhstan a few months ago and took his family with him, which is very interesting. How did he get them all out? He's a young guy. And once he got out, he started coordinating with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the sort of exiled leader of the opposition, as it were, in Russia. And Khodorkovsky got 10 hours of interviews with this young man. And he walked everybody through, basically, Putin surrounded by people that are only saying yes. Anyone who even reaches for a possible, sir, that maybe this isn't working so well, is immediately dead. And so no one will tell him the truth. So he doesn't know what is actually happening. He's just surrounded by yes men. That his health is better than we think. He's more robust than we realize. And so anyway, we got a big download. Plus the CIA has formally, publicly said, we're calling for walk-ins, they call it. And walk-ins are when you say, anybody in Russia, our door is open, come and we'll give you, you can come to America and you can have a job and you can have a life, join our side and help us understand what the heck is happening over there. So I wonder whether part of what's happened here is when the US analyzes the situation, and NATO, the question is, what would be the best outcome? And their answer is, they don't really care who wins, as it were, within Russian politics. What they care about is loose nukes. That's the goal, is to prevent nuclear weapons from falling into the wrong hands. So Prigozhin, the chef, who was Putin's private chef, who's the head of the Wagner Group, which has been Putin's private army, although technically in Russia you can't have a private army, but it is.
He's allowed it.
It's a mercenary army.
Yeah.
When that group turned on Putin, the Western view was, aha, this is going to end up as a military coup. And actually, that's not a bad result from the West's point of view. The view is we can work with the military. And it's an internal fight, just to be clear. The internal fight in Russia is between the intelligence services, used to be the KGB, now it's the FSB, aligned to one degree or another with organized crime, versus the military. And the military, of course, these guys, which are shorthand called the Siloviki asked the military to execute this war and to hit the go button on nuclear weapons. And the military is like, hey, we never got any advantages from you guys being in charge, right? You've made a ton of money. We haven't got anything. Why are we doing this again? Like, what is the logic and rationale? So there's been a kind of go slow by the Russian military, which is frustrating to Putin because he's like, why can't we just take care of this Ukrainian situation? It's because the military isn't, and they're saying we're not well equipped, we don't have what we need, da-da-da. So this is when Prigozhin decided, well, since we're losing now, we're not winning, turn on the Russian military and blame them. So it's an internal fight.
And is Prigozhin, he's aligned with that sort of former KGB intelligence thug world side of things?
Yes, that's exactly right.
Which is interesting.
But there's a twist in this theater, and this is a kind of geopolitical theater, not only a theater of war, but theatrical as well. Because when you step back and look at what happened, so Prigozhin starts heading to Moscow with, I think, roughly 8,000, mainly men, I would assume. And they're basically welcomed with open arms the whole way. The public comes out, waves at them. The leader of the opposition, Khodorkovsky, says, align with him, because anything's better than having President Putin there. And then suddenly he just stops. And he says, no, I'm not going to do it.
Holiday in Belarus.
I'm going to go to Belarus. I've cut a deal with the leader of Belarus. What? But if you look at the map afterwards, what you see is that Russian forces are now closer to their targets in Ukraine than they were before. They're 100 miles from them now, where they were hundreds of miles away before. So was the whole thing a theater, because you couldn't move that many people in the open any other way? So it's really complex. This is what they used to call Kremlinology, right? Trying to figure out who's on first.
So you think there's a chance that they were all sort of orchestrating a shift of resources?
Correct.
Interesting.
But at the same time, the end result has been that the Wagner Group people are handing their arms to the Russian military.
Are they? But they were. I thought one of the reasons this transpired was because the Russian military had asked or demanded that they all sign contracts with the military.
They said you can.
Yeah.
Or you can go to Belarus and we will honor our commitments. Okay. Putin personally said that. So they were basically saying, you can have a job with us, but we'll still be friends with you if you don't want that option. But we still want you to hand your arms over. So in the end, I'm still betting there's a chance that the Russian military ends as the winner. And we'll end up with a Russian military leader, and actually the West will be delighted with that.
Yeah.
Because the nuclear command is under the military.
Yeah.
The Siloviki, even if they got control of a physical location, they don't have the codes and they don't have the process. So that again, I keep coming back to the only concern the West has. Otherwise, they're like, we don't know about your internal politics. Loose nukes are a serious problem. Not only, by the way, because of launching, but even if you can't launch it, it's pulling it apart and then having something you could sell on the open market.
But isn't this is Robert F. Kennedy's position stated, and I think Trump even echoes this, as well as some of the intellectuals in American sort of academia now, that the U.S. has stated the goal is actually to weaken Russia. And unfortunately, Ukrainians are being used as sort of fodder in this war of sort of crippling a bit the unimpressive so far Russian power to the benefit of the U.S. at the cost of Ukrainian lives. And one of the reasons they say this is the case, or as evidence, is there has been no visible evidence of the U.S. ever trying to broker a deal. And that's what both Trump and RFK say would be one of the first things they do, because no one's ever tried. I mean, the Turks tried a bit, the Chinese have asked to get involved, but the U.S. has had, and this is one thing that I think is quite frustrating to a lot of American people as well, is billions of dollars going, but there seems to be no effort to actually stem it. Because we don't really care, if you're talking about most of the American public, whether part of the Donbass is a protectorate with allowed to Russian to be the main language or not, right? What we care about is whether this gets worse.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
the U.S. taxpaying dollars going to support a war that seems to have no end at this point.
Exactly. And then let me just add a further layer of complication to all this, which is important, is so President Xi has basically said, I want to be a peace broker.
Yeah,
right?
like he's done with Iran and Saudi.
Totally. And
right?
Saudi has said we want to be a peace broker.
Yeah, of course.
And so Saudi and China go, well, we'll all be peace brokers together.
Soft power has gone from U.S. to China now.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. And I would say maybe equally to Saudi as well.
Yeah. Well, Israel.
But Xi's got conditions, and his conditions are, I want to be able to take effective control of some of Eastern Russia, which frankly China already has, in my opinion, because they've never been able to manage it very well from Moscow. But east of the Urals is full of incredible resources, and China wants all that.
Yeah.
So they want the U.S. to not say, you shouldn't be there once it becomes clear they're already there.
Yeah.
But also, Ukraine is a negotiating chip in Taiwan. And the position that China is trying to get to is a world where Taiwan says, well, actually, we'd rather align with China than go to war and have a Ukraine situation. In other words, China uses Ukraine to say, do you want to really end up like that? Or do you want to work with us here? And our military, again, their position is the one thing we're not prepared for is a world where Taiwan says, actually, we're prepared to align with China. And that's, I think, more and more likely
They've
a
almost
scenario.
made it unlikely, even more so by the Biden administration coming out and saying more clear than ever, because it was kind of like a don't really talk about it policy, that we will defend Taiwan for the first time.
But then Anthony Blinken went to Beijing and said, we never said that, and we don't have this policy.
Yeah.
Everyone's like, wait, what? Did the White House just say we won't defend Taiwan? And that's what they said.
Yeah.
Because they're trying to broker a peace deal over Ukraine. So just yesterday, I think it was, the Canadian foreign minister came out and said, if the end result for Taiwan is that they're like Hong Kong, that is not worth having a war over. So you're starting to hear the Western world
Hawks care more about it than the Taiwanese.
That's
perhaps.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Well put.
Right.
Well put.
As we were talking about yesterday, the neocons under Bush are now in the White House under Biden.
That's the same group.
Itching for a war.
Yeah. So now in America, we have a reaction which is fascinating, which is, as you say, we now have, in my opinion, we have 4 Trumpers in the United States all campaigning for the presidency. You have Trump himself.
4 Trumpers.
You do. It's really amazing.
Yeah.
You have DeSantis.
Yeah.
Pretty much
Mini
a Trumper.
Trump.
You have RFK, who's a mirror image of Trump. really. Same
but
policies.
with a conscience.
But with a conscience and on the left.
And
But
environmental,
nonetheless,
yeah.
very aligned.
Similar.
Very similar.
Yeah.
And Suarez, the young up-and-coming Republican who's the mayor of Miami. 4 of them who actually all share the same opinion on foreign policy as Trump.
Yeah.
And the core position is, are we in these wars because it serves the military-industrial complex?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't serve the interests of the American public. And most Americans are like, it's not serving our interests.
Yep.
And so that's a vote winner, in my opinion, for that crowd. And the Biden team saying, we'll defend these places to the end is getting them nowhere.
Yeah.
So, yeah, geopolitics, I mean, basically America continues to retreat
Yeah.
from international affairs. And they'll just retreat much faster with our next president because either side, given that I don't think Biden's going to win, but we could talk about that. I think we're going to end up with an America that retreats further from where we've been.
Any questions at this point? No? One thing I find quite fascinating now, let's talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Yes.
for a moment. In American politics is confusing. You know, the whole process is confusing. You know, what are these electoral college? How do these primaries work? Why is it that somebody can't just run, and create a new party? It's quite complex. But just talk a little bit about RFK. He's now got 20-something% of the polls in the Democratic, amongst Democrats that have been polled. That's miles above anyone else, as well as anyone else below Trump, and well above DeSantis even relative to Trump. What would it take, or what is the system that will allow or disallow him to even become a legitimate threat to Biden, even the public wants him to be?
Right. So let's back up for a second. So the system
Yeah.
is set up so the sitting president just says, I'm running again, and that's a done deal.
That's it.
However, we have a president who says things like, God save the Queen, and falls down a lot.
Yeah.
And basically the joke going around Washington is that his staff understand that they can't remain in power unless he's there.
Yeah.
So this is elder abuse, basically, right? That's like the
It's
joke.
like propping him up.
Yeah. It's like, let him go to an old folks home, like don't keep him around. So every time he says something that indicates he's not able to read his own notes very well, or I think the other day when he said, that the Russians are losing in Iraq.
Yeah.
And you're like, little time has passed.
When he fell down at the West Point graduation.
And he fell down at the West Point graduation. I remember Jerry Ford, who was an athlete, President Jerry Ford, who was an athlete, tripped once.
Yeah. And that became his meme everywhere, all the time.
Permanently
Yeah.
affected his polls and his ratings and stuff. So I think what's going to happen is Biden literally will just keep tripping up. And eventually it will become clear to everyone it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And the bet you're
And
making...
do you want Kamala to be
Do you want
the
Kamala
president
to
by
be the
default?
vice president?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, for reasons that in my opinion have nothing to do with racism, but one is always accused of that if you say you're not in favor of her.
Yeah.
But for a variety of other reasons, there are a lot of Americans who are not comfortable with her as president. I think it has mainly to do with just her relative inexperience of managing issues at the national level. But
She also seems to have disappeared from the public discourse and visibly within the administration since she was sort of utilized to garner an aspect of the vote to win.
Well, 100%.
Right?
They in my opinion,
kneecapped her.
They not only kneecapped her, they locked her in her office and said, "Don't come out."
Yeah.
So it's terrible. Like
Yeah.
it's so shocking this
Kind of what
happened.
happened with Hillary in the first term of Obama, right?
And that's why Obama made Hillary Secretary of State,
Yeah.
and then called every nation and said, "Don't deal with the State Department, deal with me."
Yeah.
It was a way of keeping your
keeping them
enemies
boxed.
close.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
So the argument is he's losing it. She, we can't have a situation where he doesn't get through another 4 years and she becomes president by default. Therefore, we need to have an election.
Right, we need some
We need
alternative.
some sort of possible.
So against that backdrop, a few things are happening. And one is the traditional way you win a presidential race changes over time. And so I see some changes that are really big. One is this is, to my mind, clearly going to be a podcast presidency. And it's a big deal because mainstream media always forces you into these little sound bites. You get half an hour, you got to be really punchy. Well, mainstream media banned RFK because of his position that vaccines should be tested, right?
No,
So
well, not just mainstream media, but mainstream platforms. YouTube,
everything.
Twitter.
Totally.
Yeah.
But now he's announced he's a presidential candidate, so they can't ban him. So
And what's his name? Elon Musk has also lifted this sort of censorship on Twitter.
Right.
So open dialogue.
Right. So now he was clever. The first things he's done are very long form podcasts with Joe Rogan, where he gets to go into immense detail about why is this his position. And it becomes much harder to argue with him because if you say to people, do you really want vaccines that are not tested? No one will say yes, right? But so he
and he's compelling in these long form
He's very
dialogues.
compelling in the long form dialogues.
He's very compelling.
And also, well, there's some other things too, but the key point is he has shown that he gets to choose his interviewer when he does a podcast. Unlike mainstream media interviews where the interviewer is not only chosen for you, but meant to be hostile to you.
Yeah.
No, now he can just riff with somebody who's open-minded to what he's saying. And that means we're going to have a very different kind of political debate. And second, I think his very raspy, weak voice is a massive advantage. And people are like, what? How can that be? But I watched the other day, Piers Morgan interviewed him, and
who's, if you don't know him, he's the ultimate bully interviewer.
He's the ultimate bully interviewer. And
he couldn't.
He couldn't because if you interrupt RFK, you look like such a bully. Because of his voice, you have to give him a wide berth to finish his sentence.
That's true.
And he uses this to his advantage. I think it's really clever. So anyway, but interestingly, like I said, Trump, who's still in the mix and has the highest approval ratings of all of them, and if you held the race today, he wins. Like, it's incredible. But he's on his way into a major prosecution for, did he sell access to the Oval Office for personal gain? That's the fundamental question. Did his family get financed in exchange for secrets sold from the Oval Office? And I've written about my speculation that the reason those particular documents were taken to Mar-a-Lago and confirmed by the fact that the only people who can read them have the highest level security clearance is because they're related to nuclear. And so did he sell nuclear secrets in exchange for getting his family businesses funded is the question.
Oh, interesting.
Now that is going to take a long time to
But
dig
they've moved
into.
now the date of that hearing
They're going to keep
towards
moving it forward.
New Year, but they're going to try and get it done prior to the election. But it may be that even if they do, the actual, I mean, what's the possibility that he will still be able to run or not run based on where things are?
The point is to leave a massive question mark over his head at all times.
And is there precedent where if you are, because he sort of used this when he was running against Biden, or no, prior to that you can't really go after me legally if I'm a candidate up for election, because that would
Correct. So he'll try
create
this.
problems, right?
Right. So then it comes down to the swing vote, and the elements of the swing vote are super interesting. One is middle-aged women, and middle-aged women, even if they are Trump supporters on policy, they are exhausted with having to turn the TV off every time he comes on air because the kids can't listen to what he says, right?
Sure.
And they are not happy about a president who may have broken the Constitution, right? So it's funny because they were all in favor of Trump go to Washington to basically burn Washington down, but to not burn the Constitution down.
Yeah, and also his position with women and so forth is a challenge, whereas RFK offers this different
RFK has issues with women too.
Well, for sure.
But what's interesting is the American
I'm sure
public.
that will come out.
It's already
more,
out, yeah. But what's interesting, and this is fascinating to me, is both Trump and RFK, how do I put this? Many men, not all men, but many men envy the womanizing, and many women are attracted to the mojo. Like, look how many women were involved with President Trump. You're like, where are all these people coming from?
Much more to RFK, though. Probably,
and there's a lot of women who
he's
think
fit.
And he's weightlifting, right? And
he's doing push-ups with his shirt off.
He's doing the
on his
Putin
videos.
shirt off thing, and it's working when you look at the polls.
Well, and plus the history. I mean, Trump is, I think, in awe of the Kennedys. He wants his family to be the Kennedys, right? Yes. So, but what's interesting, and you mentioned this before, is it's a podcast-oriented election that might swing. And having looked at media in relation to elections in the past, and RFK actually mentioned this, it was very clear that it was the television, the introduction of the television at the time, just around the time of the Nixon-Kennedy debates, that led to Kennedy winning, because he was good looking, he was extremely eloquent, and on camera, Nixon looked pallid and sweating, and it was narrow victory. But they do, and media historians say that was because of television that Kennedy won. Obama, I believe, had a huge advantage and played to that advantage and became, I would say, the YouTube president, because he leveraged online video in a way that his competitor could not do, didn't understand, didn't leverage that sort of youthful energy of YouTube at the time. Trump, obviously the Twitter president, and now we'll see. It's a podcast debate, but both Trump and, I would say, RFK are strong in that space. They're very good in the long interview. They sound more credible. People don't necessarily challenge them because they don't really allow themselves to be challenged for whatever dynamic occurs. But what do you think would have to happen for him to be considered a legitimate Democratic candidate? Or will it be, he will not be allowed to, he'll run as an independent, and then maybe, as has been predicted by some, it may be a double ticket of some sort between Trump and RFK?
So this is the really interesting bit. And by the way, just for our audience, I mean, to be clear, you ran YouTube. You're one of the leading experts in the world on this fundamental question of the message is the medium. Yeah,
and everyone in YouTube was sort of rooting for Obama as well at the time.
There you go.
I mean, we had a big party at YouTube when he was elected, and also because we were very proud that YouTube played a part in it. It wasn't like we were pulling the levers, but it was obviously, Google, not surprisingly, was mostly staffed by people who were quite anti what Bush represented, and Democratic and liberal.
So I have a question for you. Just I'll come back to how do you actually get to the presidency under the current circumstances, but this business of the platforms, the Silicon Valley platforms, trying to censor everybody, but particularly RFK, and then they had to stop once he declared, but I actually think it made RFK more popular to be banned from Instagram.
It did. And you are finding a lot of Democrats, already the Republicans were there, and they're a lot more quite anti-vaxxers, but when you give them a chance to speak in long form and you listen to him, if you were now questioning your sort of pro-vax position, having been a dutiful citizen, and sort of berated by everyone in the media to just get it done, and here it is, hashtag I was vaxxed. Now you're like, why the fuck did I do that?
Yeah.
And you're regretting, and you're meeting people that have long COVID, and you're seeing that actually it might not have had any difference, and these things were not tested properly. There's lots of questions, and so now you're feeling duped. And the only person that's speaking what is perceived by me as the truth now are RFK and Trump, with regard to that. Trump, though, sounding more irrational than RFK, because he actually has this sort of pedigree of fighting the big man, fighting against pollution, fighting against environmental degradation. So it's an interesting space. But
these are actually the key points that I think the media hasn't clocked yet, which is, so Trump and Biden are now both under investigation.
Yes.
For selling access to the Oval Office for private financing.
Right.
Lots of Democrats don't want to concede this point, but it's clear, even from a few weeks ago, that the FBI is so-called caved, because normally the FBI and the Department of Justice would never prosecute their own president, obviously. Yep. But the amount of evidence that somehow payments got made through Hunter Biden to family members is sufficiently compelling that the Republican leadership in Congress is going to dig into this. Mm-hmm. Having worked in the White House, bottom line is it doesn't matter whether it's true or not true. What matters is this will take an enormous amount of the president's time. Mm-hmm. And legal counsel will be forced to focus on this. There are only so many hours in a day. Yep. So it will definitely undermine his ability to run a presidential election.
It's going to get worse on that front.
And it's going to get a lot worse on that front.
Yeah, and I think,
So the younger guys can now come up. Sorry.
No, you're right. I think younger guys on both sides, and just this general fatigue. I think anyone who would have voted for Bernie Sanders previously will probably be thinking very carefully, if not already committed to supporting RFK.
Completely.
And those guys, once Bernie was out, switched to support Trump, many of whom, right? Yeah. Just because they were tired of the establishment. It's going to be an interesting one for sure. And in terms of the outcomes from that, on a global basis?
Ooh, let me just quickly do your earlier question, because this is the key thing, is
Yeah.
could we get an alliance between Trump and RFK?
Yeah.
I think yes, but the definition of that alliance could be very different. It could be the kind of alliance that allows Trump to have a presidential pardon. It could be the kind of alliance that allows RFK to choose, dare I say, somebody like Suarez as a running mate. Now you've got a Hispanic Republican as a vice president, and a
So RFK
Democrat.
takes Suarez as a running against.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's
But as an independent?
No, because in the end, what's going to happen is
He could
as
switch
these
sides.
people get more popular, the system won't be able to contain the forces at work here.
Right.
And so the question will be, well, does anybody care who the Democratic nominee is? You can have that discussion, but the race has moved on, right?
Yeah, and I think people are longing for a centrist in either case.
Both
right? They're looking for somebody.
particularly RFK is going right for the middle, because all of the money, all of the arguments are at the extremes. Nobody's going straight down the fairway, as it were.
Yeah.
So, and the public wants, they've wanted for years, bipartisanship to come back. And RFK is so exemplary of this. And so, and in addition, I think honestly, the thing about Trump that people can't handle is he's just so rude. He's so like shocking. And to have someone say the same ideas, but in such an elegant, considered, poetic language. So like, this is good.
Yeah, the conservative right, I think, had to swallow a bitter pill voting for him because it was in the greater interest of the religious interest, even though he was a very unreligious and man in much greater repentance. But having a Catholic come in, even though that's slightly different than the evangelical crowd, could be a savior in their regard, right?
And notice Suarez is an evangelical.
Interesting.
Suarez
there you go.
So now you've got a twofer right there.
Yeah. Well, here's the fly in the ointment, though. Let's say that is the case. He's come out very clearly and said the CIA killed my father.
Yes.
And my uncle and my father.
Yes.
Robert F. Kennedy, who was a senator running for president at the time. Let's say he were to become a candidate. Do you think he would be allowed to make it to the White House? Or if he were allowed to make it to the White House, how long would he last?
So I think he was so clever that in his very first long-form interview with Joe Rogan, he hits this nail on the head. And basically now, the CIA and the establishment better darn well make sure nothing happens to him.
Yeah.
Because if something does, everyone's going to go, you did that.
Yeah, if he gets hit
so
by
actually, they can't take him out now. I mean, it's really smart.
Imagine if you're a pilot of any plane he's on, you got to fly
He's
this
going to get this guy there safely, or the whole country. Because look, this is about trust and confidence in government, in leadership.
Yeah, but for how long? I mean, ultimately, Kennedy was already the president. He fought against military establishment. He fought against putting troops into Cuba. He fought against all these things. He would be a disaster for if you call it, I don't know how you call it, but he would be a disaster for the status quo in many ways in terms of the current foreign policy, current policy in education around food, nutrition, I mean, all these areas, environmental concerns.
100%. So this is the thing, it's kind of a civil war now.
Yeah.
It's between the establishment and the anti-establishment.
Yeah.
And this is the fight.
This maybe is the big upheaval that's necessary.
Well, it was going to eventually reach this point.
Yeah.
But what's interesting, again, just to finish on RFK, is that if you really listen to his positions, he is an old-fashioned Republican on market and economic issues, right? So he doesn't say we should tax the rich to high heaven. He says we need entrepreneurs. They're the innovators who are giving us new technology. We can do things better. And he's green, right? Super green, as is Suarez, by the way. So now we're going to have two younger candidates that are both environmentalists and Bitcoiners.
Yeah.
That is really fast. Especially, this is fascinating. How do we navigate that? And both of them in favor of greater transparency on government. To show, what are you guys doing with all the money? What is the power structure really about?
Exactly.
A lot of Americans actually, I think, are going to say, yeah.
And people flocking to his campaign are quite remarkable. Some of the greatest minds of, that were big voices during COVID.
Yes.
Charles Eisenstein, intellectuals, other people have a lot to say. It's quite fascinating. What I found interesting on his position in regard to RFK on the environment is that he thinks that there are aspects of the government currently that are using issues around the environment to make people feel bad about themselves and trying to force behavior change in a way that's irrational by basically overemphasizing the dangers in the short term and not thinking enough about a long-term approach. And so I think a lot of the right are embracing him in that regard, because they're saying, yes, this whole sort of Greta Thunberg, feel bad about yourself, don't take an airplane, hysteria,
Yes.
and pushing that into the schools has gone too far.
I think there's also another big piece of this puzzle, which is the African American vote.
Yeah.
And the Democrats always think they own that vote, which annoys the African American
Even
community to
stated
high
as much.
heaven.
If you don't vote for me, you're not black.
Right,
That
which
was the
is
famous Biden quote.
Yeah, this is really irritating to that
Disgusting.
whole, because the African American community in America are fundamentally entrepreneurs, mainly because no one would hire them, right? So they built their own businesses, and so they understand very well what happens if you create harder conditions for entrepreneurs to operate. And so they lean towards a Republican position on economic issues. But RFK is also a conservative Democrat on social issues. So he supports Roe versus Wade. He's against government bothering you after you've entered your home. And specifically, and I think the most important thing for this election, he is crystal clear that he is going to make it no longer an incarceration offense to have weed in your pocket. And look how many African Americans have lost family members to the justice system for tiny infractions at a time when now we're legalizing that in many states.
No, it's ridiculous. The prisons are full
They're
of people.
full of these young, innocent kids who just were, smoking a spliff one afternoon and got done.
Yeah.
So he said, not only am I going to stop that, but I'm going to let them all out.
So you're saying that he will capture the sort of angry minority vote.
He'll capture
That
both.
is also, I mean, that's, we're sitting here in France right now, and Paris is ablaze. There are people up in arms for perceived, racism against young people of Arab descent, in particular, Arab and black.
Completely. So Politico magazine said RFK is the most trusted white man in black America.
And he carries that with
And
his family
he
history.
does, because of the family history.
Yeah.
Like, no one has a clearer family history of trying to right those injustices than that family.
But what's crazy is it also lights up all these sort of conspiracy theorists who are just like, I knew I was right.
Yeah.
And so this is going to be a fascinating time. But let's bring it back to Europe for a second. Okay. You mentioned something earlier today that a lot of us were quite surprised around with regard to Ukraine. You said, everybody's focusing their attention on Ukraine and Russia, and, there's this drama happening, the Kremlin perhaps, but let's keep our eye on Poland as well. And we're all like, Poland? Why Poland? So tell us your theory on why we should be keeping our eye on Poland.
Yeah, so I've described it as Washington's more frightened of Poland than Russia. And on the view that we can probably figure out how to cut a deal regarding Russia. But we can't cut a deal with the Poles. The Poles are going their own way. They're about to have the largest military in Western Europe. Because as they go from spending 1% of their GDP to 3 or 4, that makes them huge. And their view on Ukraine is, you don't understand the Russians. You NATO, you Westerners, you Americans, you don't get that if we cut some deal and they get to keep the Donbass, then they'll be fine and leave us alone. No, they will come back with a vengeance. And so they have a much more aggressive view about containing Russia at a time when they're also seeing, China taking more and more of the east of the Russian economy, at least. And in the West, what's in play are the Baltics and Scandinavia. Now, the Baltics traditionally were aligned with Poland, right? I wrote a paper actually called The Empire Strikes Back, where I was arguing all the old empires of Western Europe are bubbling back to life. And one of them is the Polish Commonwealth, which was with Lithuania and Latvia, and they're all frightened of Russia. So, and if you look at the map, what the Polish Empire was is what Poland aspires to now. And that means pushing the Russians really far back. Like, maybe you get to keep Moscow, but maybe not even that.
Who's in charge? Let's zoom in on Poland for a second. Who's in charge now? What's their position? Are they part of this trend in Europe lurching towards more right?
So I honestly can't give you a good rundown right now. I'm really digging into this right now. What I'm more interested in is what's the grassroots phenomena, and maybe putting it in a nutshell, controversially, is Poland is kind of Trump-like. The Polish have become Trumpers on, meaning be tough on this issue. Now, Trump's position, ironically, is cut a deal with the Russians and let them have what they want.
Yeah.
So they're no longer aligned.
Yeah.
But in the sense that the Poles have a very hard line. And so do most of the old Eastern Bloc countries.
Yeah.
They're like, this problem is not just going to go away.
But it's interesting because, there's another line of thought that is, it's just a bunch of, hand-wringing and over, I'd say, hyperbole with regard to Russia having designs outside of this adventure into eastern Ukraine. They don't have the resources. It would not be acceptable. And in fact, it was more of a perceived breach of the Minsk Accord of agreements that led Russia to be concerned about the sort of move of NATO into Ukraine. And it's more of a preemptive position. That's what RFK's position is, interestingly, where he's saying,
It is.
We've aggravated them. They were doing something that we don't agree with, but in fact, our hands are not clean in this issue. This is not them just kind of expanding east like all the people are saying. Is there some? I don't know. This is a big question around American provocation. We're already seeing it in Asia. It seems very clear that since Bush, America has been very provocative with regard to expansion of NATO and cornering of Russia. Russia has accepted nukes and other arms right at its doorstep that the U.S. would never have accepted or never did accept in the past in terms of proximity and power. So how much of this is, in your view, actual continuous U.S. provocation, and Russia, in a way, is just trying to hold its ground and save face?
So the thing is, one thing I've learned from living in Europe my entire adult life is every single conflict, when you start to unwind the thread, you will bump into the previous conflict and the previous conflict, and no one ever forgets anything.
Yeah.
So memories are forever, and the people will still be angry about events that happened 150 years ago.
Yep.
In every single pocket of Europe. So I think there is truth to the idea that we, the United States, promised the Russians that we would not expand NATO, and then we forgot.
Yep.
And we just did it, and we didn't think through the consequences. I think it's part of a
That
bigger...
sounds quite passive.
I do,
suppose
and I
probably
take,
more aggressive.
I take a slightly more passive view of it. I think it was arrogance rather than aggressiveness. There's a difference.
Right.
And our arrogance was, since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union, we treated Russia as a puny, unimportant sidebar, because we judge everything by economic might.
Yes.
And so Russia was only powerful because of its nuclear weapons. But once that was out of the way, we're like, yeah, you're some small fry that's lucky to be in this party. And the Russians were so offended by this.
Yeah.
And that has underpinned all of these issues.
Yeah.
Right?
So less by design and more arrogance. I mean, I guess the
think it's
Americans have
more
been accused of arrogance in the
than-
past, and I suppose that's been true to some extent.
But maybe I just don't think dark enough.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not a neocon, so hard for me to go there. But there's other things too, which is once Russia started to threaten nuclear weapons, and now they have moved nuclear weapons into Belarus, right on the border with NATO countries. And the threats, like I mentioned earlier, from the Norwegian perspective and the Arctic, and that's a different thing. So now that has to be addressed. Back
So we're
to
transitioning.
Tor's question.
Yeah, I took my sweater off in case you're noticing.
I have
was a
got
bit
water
hot.
now.
Changing topic. So we were on geopolitics, and we started thinking about exopolitics, was it? Maybe there's something greater out there happening beyond our small, feud between human beings on this particular planet. And the question came up around psychedelics and its place in perhaps a solution or some sort of contributor to a kinder, gentler world.
I've also had the opportunity to talk to people who are real experts in the subjects, people like Paul Stamets, who's the world leading expert on psilocybin, for example.
Yep.
And
Mushroom man.
militaries are very actively using these substances to deal with PTSD and their special ops. And also not just that, but to enhance their effectiveness in the field. Because one of the things that it can do is, and of course, what is the edge? There's a lot of things, there's a long list, but one of the things is to increase one's sensitivity to the environment. And so special ops, they work without being able to speak. They need to communicate with each other, and they know each other almost so well.
So you're saying Delta Force is microdosing?
They are. No, we know this is a fact, right? There's a wonderful book Jamie Wheel wrote about this. Do you know
Stealing Fire? Yeah.
Stealing Fire.
Yeah.
He talks about the work being done. So there's something afoot. As we legalize, particularly marijuana, but also psilocybin, and a broader range of humans are experiencing this,
yes,
it is causing people to think more holistically, care more about the environment, frankly, open hearts more. And I don't know, I just think, yeah,
for sure,
this is a powerful force.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a common outcome for people of any background, of any religious persuasion, is by the end of their experience, they're literally singing Kumbaya, Kumbaya, hugging each other and feeling a very strong interconnectedness with each other and the planet. I think that's common across almost all forms of psychedelics, and why you can think perhaps that was seen as a threat before they shut down access in the 70s and the rising voices against the Vietnam War, for example. It's perhaps inconvenient to the powers that be for people to be more conscious and aware and feeling more interconnected with each other domestically and internationally, right?
So a question that has come up to me quite a lot in geopolitics is, couldn't you, Pippa, just get these people who are running these superpower countries to go take these things?
Yeah.
And then I'm like, can you get some psilocybin to President Putin, basically, is the question.
Yeah.
Or to any of our leaders. And it sounds so hilarious. And they're like,
yeah, let's try that in the Middle
I don't know.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's a discussion about this.
Yes.
And would you think the same way? Anyway, it's a fascinating subject. It's a fascinating new frontier of the world economy as well.
Well, I think it's behind, and if if you're familiar with some of the characters in these sort of green new venture capitalism, people, the sort of Burning Man culture expanding to, and if you go to Burning Man, you'll see there are all these different CEOs and high-powered tech executives in particular who are experiencing psychedelics in this environment and outside of this environment, and it's affecting where they put their money. They're investing in green technology, they're investing in protection of the environment, they're investing in new types of approaches to legal uses of psychedelics. It's quite obvious you have this rising tide of investment. Do you think that we will see more of this, or do you think it might get to a point where, again, someone in power says, nope, this is becoming inconvenient to the state?
No, I think this is an ongoing trend. And as younger people come up in the system, they think this is perfectly normal, mainstream. Yeah. And let's face it, humanity has used these things for millennia. It's only since 1971 that this has really been so, made so illegal.
Yeah.
So there's a generation change afoot. But having said that, I'd be interested in your views about the conditions under which one does these things.
Yep.
So, when I was young, I grew up as a Mormon, so that's one reason I never did anything. But people did this stuff at parties.
Yep.
And now, later in life that I've done this, I'm like, parties are probably the last place that you want to be doing this. And you've got a lot of experience of working with indigenous tribes of various kinds, and the way they create a container and a safe space. And I do think, especially now, America has a really severe recreational drug problem that's killing people on an epic scale. And RFK, again, I don't mean to keep coming back to him, but the fact that he has a lot of experience with this, and I think at one point he was a heroin addict, and he was arrested on heroin charges when he was young.
That's right, he had a lot of trouble in his teens.
He had a lot, and kind of everybody,
early 20s,
and everybody kind of forgives him because he was at such a tender age.
Right, he talks about being sober and then going to law school after
right,
that,
right. Yeah. And to lose your father and your uncle
traumatic.
In such a public way is so what pressures. Anyway, and so now that having that leadership come up and say, well, I understand this subject.
Yes.
I think we'll get more people say, I understand this subject.
Yeah.
But it's not that it'll be just suddenly made legal for anyone to use any time. It'll be under protected circumstances.
Yeah, and yeah, I think so. And there are concerns now on the proliferation of access, legal and illegal, of all these different substances, from marijuana to making, for example, ketamine therapy available to people with resistant treatment, depression, extremely effective. But now the requirements to be treated becoming less rigid. It's one of those things that unless you continue to create safe spaces for these things to transpire, or guidelines, or perhaps even somebody suggested, somebody's like to get a driver's license, you go to license to utilize psychedelics responsibly, why not? Then that could create a real flowering of a rising consciousness and more caring society, I would believe. But you also are at risk of people confronting trauma through these experiences and not having a place where they can be held and integrate that information, causing, if it's not done correctly, an even greater increase in kind of mental health concerns, right? So, there will constantly be this sort of push and pull, but I think it is moving in the right direction. MAPS is moving very quickly to try and reduce the barriers to entry for clinics to be able to offer this. The number of years of education, having a master's degree to be able to administer psychedelic therapy has now been reduced to just having a license. So because there are going to be so many clinics opening and just don't have enough people to man them that have the requirements. But I think there still is this risk, however, of a clamping down if the ones that get into power are finding this rising consciousness to be a threat to their existence. I wouldn't put it past them, and that's something that I would suggest, if you want to read on this, Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, or This Is Your Mind on Plants. And interestingly, Brian Marescu, who wrote this book,
I love him.
The Immortality Key, he's another one of these great sort of intellectual voices coming out and saying, look, guys, this is nothing new. If you're a religious person and you want to feel justified in your interest in this and not feel like you have to hide it from civil conversation and conversations with your friends and parents. They've been doing this for thousands and thousands of years. We have proof that for 2,000 years in ancient Greece, they had a ceremony in the Eleusinian Mysteries where they would be invited to go into a cave and take this drink called the koukion, which is a psychedelic substance. And this is the birthplace of democracy. For 2,000 years, the greatest thinkers, Plato, Euripides, all these people went through this process, and it was an explosion of creativity. 2,000 years. And even in Christian ceremonies, it was believed that the wine might have included some sort of psychedelic substance, and there's archaeological evidence of this, perhaps.
Yes.
So I think this is all leaning towards more people of different backgrounds who've had, I would say, immediate infused fear against it, being much more open to experiencing it. Well, it'll be interesting to see where things go.
Yeah, very interesting. Just one other little piece on this. I always thought it was fascinating that somehow a decision was taken to administer LSD to the Manhattan Project scientists who invented the nuclear bomb.
Oh, really?
And the reason was because they were so afraid if they were ever captured by the Russians that they would reveal the nuclear secrets. Mm-hmm. Obviously not having taken them themselves, that no one is capable of explaining anything.
That's the irony. You get fired for your job by taking it as an employee of the U.S. government, but they're administering it to scientists.
But they were
It was the MK Ultra.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do know.
Oh, you can't tell me because you're involved. No. You have to kill me if you told me.
But it is clear, Richard Feynman, who was probably the leading scientific mind of the last 100 years in the West, he continued to be an LSD user all his life, microdosing basically. And when you listen to his lectures with that in mind, I always was impressed by his, I think it's the Daisy lecture, where he talks about, it's very short, it's on YouTube, and
We'll share it in the show notes.
Yes, we'll share it in the show notes. And he says, my best friend is an artist, and he says, I always destroy the beauty around me because I'll see a flower and he'll see the petals and the beauty of the flower, and I see the subatomic structure underneath the flower. And you're like, I think he's been doing some acid while he's looking at flowers. But it did that impact on his scientific ability to see connections.
Well, look, I think it's undeniable that it was the use of LSD in particular, played a very important role in Steve Jobs' open-mindedness and tapping into some other levels of creativity to create beautiful products and have that sort of conscious approach to business as well. I understand actually that the person who created the PCR test had this eureka moment under the influence of LSD as well. A lot of these, and the creation of certain movements, many of whom you may be familiar with, were conceived, or the light went off during these moments of deep reflection under the influence of psychedelics, because new connections are made. I don't think we even know it anywhere near how often it's actually used by people in Silicon Valley and scientists and coders to tap into new sources of thought. I think this is just now becoming more open and available to the public in terms of knowledge because of these books that have been written and more prominent people coming out. And maybe under RFK there will be more public discussion about it. But I think there is this fear amongst those in this space that it will then just be co-opted by corporations who will try now to patent, the molecules that have been used for thousands of years by indigenous cultures. And while they will be arrested going from one country to another carrying these leaves, pharmaceutical companies will be making billions selling them to the public with no concern. This is a big fear, particularly amongst the indigenous people who fear that their use without that sort of conscious approach and understanding really the nature in which they can be used to the most effect will create a huge crisis and actually be bad for them in the long run. Well, this has been fun. Thank you for your time.
Yeah.
And see you guys again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to speak with you.
Exactly.
Yeah.